Welcome to Teaching Truth. Many years ago, we used to sing an old hymn, and the chorus of that old hymn went like this. Count your blessings, name them one by one. Count your blessings, see what God hath done. Count your blessings, name them one by one, and it will surprise you what the Lord has done. Count your blessings. Well, Jacob at the end of his life, as he's lying dying, is counting his blessings, not just reflecting back over his 147 years of life and reflecting on all the blessings that have come from God. But Jacob is reflecting on the blessings that he is experiencing in the present. You see, Jacob, as he was dying, knew that all his blessings were not in the past. And often we can rely on the blessings of the past. It's good to give thanks to God, for sure, for the blessings of the past. But think about the ways in which God has blessed and is blessing you right now, even today, even as you are listening to this reflection. Jacob reflected on the present. And the Lord placed some things right in front of Jacob physically that reminded Jacob of God's blessings to him at that particular time. The evidence of God's grace. Jacob embraces his grandsons, the two sons of Joseph. Now, think about the significance of this, because there was a time, remember, that Jacob thought Joseph was dead. Remember what his brothers, his long-lost family, his brothers had said to his father. And so there was a time that Jacob thought Joseph was gone, and there would be no offspring at all from that son. Yet now, by the grace of God and the hidden hand of God at work in Joseph's life and in Jacob's life, Jacob not only sees Joseph again, that's great in and of itself, but also he gets more into the bargain. He sees Joseph's two boys. Now that is God's grace and God's goodness in action. Jacob physically sees in front of him the two sons of Joseph. Can you see physically as well as spiritually the evidence of God's grace and kindness and mercy and goodness around you today? I can see that in my own family. I can see it in so many ways. I can see it in the church of which we are a part. When we pause and look, we can actually see the evidence of God's grace. We don't need to look too far to count our blessings, to see the evidence of God's blessing and the evidence of God's grace. There was also in verses 5 to 6 of Genesis 48, the expansion of grace. What do I mean by that? Well, Jacob adopts the two sons of Joseph and gives them an inheritance among Joseph's brothers. In other words, he writes them into his last will and testament. He's not excluding them. He wants them to receive that inheritance. He is in effect giving Joseph the double portion of the firstborn. When the inheritance of the nation of Israel was given out many years later, note this, there was no tribe of Joseph, but there were tribes of Manasseh and Ephraim. Do you see the significance of that? Do you see the significance of that? The grace that was active in Jacob's life flowed from him to the successive generations. The baton of grace, as it were, the baton of God's goodness and blessing was being passed. In other words, because of the grace that was on him, that is Jacob, he was able to hand down a heritage, a legacy, a baton of blessing to those who followed him. And that is what we need to be doing today. Just as Jacob handed down his blessings to his grandsons, are we handing down, as it were, the gifts of God's grace, our experience of God's grace, the blessings that we have, material, financial, spiritual, and in every other way, to those who are following after us, to our children, to our grandchildren, to those with whom we share. I want to, when I leave this earthly life, leave a legacy that will stand the test of time to others who will come behind me, and particularly to my son, Lewis. A legacy that is not just financial and in a sense that is secondary, but a legacy that is spiritual. A legacy that my own father left, a spiritual legacy, not just a financial legacy. But there was also the economy of grace, verses 12 to 20. In these verses, Jacob blesses Joseph's sons. But Jacob gives the blessing of the firstborn to Ephraim instead of Manasseh. And Joseph, as we read in the passage, tries to intervene. He suspects that Jacob, because he hasn't been to Specsavers and because he needs to go to Specsavers, couldn't physically see what he was doing. But Jacob was carrying out, note this, the will of the Lord. And he knew exactly what he was doing. In the kingdom years that followed, Ephraim became the most powerful and populous tribe in Israel. What was the second most populous? It was Manasseh. God gave the blessing through Jacob to whom he chose. God determines who gets the blessing. That is the way of grace. God blesses whom he will. God uses whom he will. And sometimes God can choose one over another, as we see here, without human explanation. And we simply need to, as it were, trust God and leave that with God. I'm often reminded of the late Reverend Dr. Billy Graham, who in his excellent book, Just As I Am, wrote these words. He said, "I have often said that the first thing I am going to do when I get to heaven is to ask, why me, Lord? Why did you choose a farm boy from North Carolina to preach to so many people, to have such a wonderful team of associates, and to have a part in what you were doing in the latter half of the 20th century? I have thought about that question a great deal, but I know also that only God knows the answer." God blessed the late Reverend Dr. Billy Graham with the gift of evangelism. And he himself would say he didn't know why he was blessed with that. But God blessed him. God used him. God blesses whom he will, and God uses whom he will. God chose the late Reverend Dr. Billy Graham without explanation. Perhaps when we get to heaven, we'll understand why Billy Graham was used and chosen of God to be that vessel for God. And so Jacob, at 147 years of age, as he lies dying, his sight almost gone, reflects on the present, the evidence of grace. He embraces the two sons of Joseph. He adopts the two sons of Joseph. He expands that grace. And we see also the economy of grace. We see God blessing whom he will, and God using whom he will. God used Jacob, and God, through the baton of blessing that was passed, used his two grandsons in the years that would follow. May we be those who would pass on a legacy, a baton of blessing.